March 11, 2026, 6:14 a.m. local time, the Taiwan Strait. A U.S. Air Force RC-135V Rivet Joint Electronic Surveillance aircraft is flying a routine orbit at 28,000 feet along the median line of the Taiwan Strait. Its crew of 27 intelligence specialists has been monitoring PLA communications for 12 hours straight. Standard mission, standard signals. Then, everything changes. In the space of 40 minutes, the aircraft's electronic surveillance suite registers over 1,400 new military communications emanating from the Chinese coastline between Fuzhou and Xiamen. That number is 6 times the normal daily volume. The communications are encrypted, but the sheer density tells the crew everything they need to know. Something massive is moving. Satellite imagery from a KH-11 Block 5 reconnaissance pass at 7:02 a.m. confirms it. Across 4 separate naval bases, Ningbo, Xiamen, Fuzhou, and Zhangjiang, the PLA Navy's Eastern Theater Command is surging warships to sea at a pace not seen since the 2022 Taiwan crisis. Except this time, the numbers are far larger. 60 warships, moving east toward Taiwan. I'm your host at Navy Axis, where we break down the most critical naval operations shaping global power. And today, we're examining the most dangerous 72 hours in the Western Pacific since the Korean War. Because Beijing didn't pick this moment by accident. They picked it because the United States was already fighting a war 6,000 miles away. And for the first time in a generation, the math didn't work in America's favor. To understand why March 11th happened, you have to understand what was happening in the Persian Gulf. 48 hours earlier, on March 9th, U.S. carrier-launched aircraft from the USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Harry S. Truman began sustained combat operations against Iranian naval infrastructure. Operation Trident Reach. The strikes targeted IRGC fast attack boat bases at Bandar Abbas and Bushehr, coastal missile batteries along the Strait of Hormuz, and underground command facilities buried in the Zagros Mountains. The Lincoln's Air Wing, Carrier Air Wing 9, was flying 32 sorties per day. F/A-18E Super Hornets carrying JDAM precision munitions. EA-18G Growlers jamming Iranian radar. E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes coordinating the entire kill chain from 25,000 feet. The Truman's Air Wing was doing the same. 2 carriers, over 60 combat aircraft in continuous rotation, escorted by 4 Aegis destroyers, 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers, and a Virginia-class submarine providing undersea security. That is an enormous amount of American naval power concentrated in one theater, and Beijing noticed. Sources within the U.S. intelligence community later confirmed that Chinese military planners had been watching U.S. force disposition in real time through a combination of Yaogan reconnaissance satellites, civilian maritime tracking data, and signals intelligence from electronic listening stations on Hainan Island. The moment both U.S. carriers began active combat operations in the Gulf, a classified order went out from the Central Military Commission in Beijing. Execute Exercise Typhoon Gate. The name was deliberately bland, but the operation was anything but routine. At Naval Base Ningbo, 4 Type 055 Renhai-class destroyers cast off their mooring lines within 40 minutes of each other. These are China's most capable surface combatants, 12,800 tons displacement, 112 vertical launch cells carrying a mix of YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles, HHQ-9B long-range surface-to-air missiles, and U-8 anti-submarine rockets. Each destroyer carries more firepower than most nations' entire navies. Behind them, 8 Type 052D Luoyang 3 destroyers followed into the East China Sea. 64 VLS cells each. Phased array radar systems modeled on the American Aegis architecture. These ships formed the air defense backbone of the surge fleet. From Zhangjiang in the south, the PLA Navy's amphibious force sortied. 3 Type 075 Yushin-class amphibious assault ships, 40,000-ton flat-deck vessels capable of carrying 30 helicopters and a full Marine battalion each. Alongside them, 4 Type 071 Yuzhou-class amphibious transport docks, each loaded with air cushion landing craft and armored vehicles. That's enough amphibious capacity to land roughly 12,000 Marines on a hostile shoreline And then there were the submarines. At least 2 Type 094 Jin-class ballistic missile submarines surfaced briefly in the waters east of Fujian Province before diving again. Each carries 12 JL-2 intercontinental ballistic missiles with a range of 7,400 nautical miles. These submarines don't participate in conventional naval operations. Their appearance was a signal, not to Taiwan, but to Washington. The message: if you escalate, we have second strike capability. Don't forget it. By noon on March 11th, American intelligence analysts at Indopacom headquarters in Camp Smith, Hawaii, had identified 61 distinct PLA Navy vessels operating within 90 nautical miles of Taiwan's median line. Support vessels, replenishment ships, submarine tenders, electronic intelligence collectors brought the total formation to over 70 platforms. Beijing's Ministry of National Defense issued a terse statement at 2 p.m. Beijing time. The People's Liberation Army Navy is conducting routine readiness exercises in waters under Chinese jurisdiction. These exercises are not directed at any party. Nobody believed it. Not in Taipei, not in Tokyo, and certainly not at the Pentagon. The problem facing U.S. Pacific Command was brutally simple arithmetic. With the Lincoln and Truman committed to Persian Gulf operations, the only U.S. carrier presence in the entire Western Pacific was the USS Ronald Reagan, home-ported at Yokosuka, Japan. The Reagan had recently completed a maintenance availability period and was operating with a reduced air wing. Carrier Air Wing 5 had only 38 operational aircraft instead of its normal complement of over 60. 2 FA-18E squadrons were still rotating replacement aircraft from Naval Air Station Lemoore in California. 1 carrier, 38 aircraft, against 60-plus PLA Navy warships backed by land-based air power from hundreds of J-16, J-20 stealth fighters, and H-6K bombers carrying YJ-12 anti-ship missiles. Admiral Thomas Richter, commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet, was aboard the Reagan when the intelligence report started flowing in. Declassified communications logs show he immediately requested authorization to move the Reagan south from its operating area near Okinawa toward the Taiwan Strait. The request went up the chain of command. Indopacom to the Joint Chiefs. The Joint Chiefs to the Secretary of Defense. The answer came back in 2 hours. Denied. Moving the Reagan south would be interpreted as a direct challenge to the PLA surge. With U.S. forces already engaged in combat against Iran, the National Security Council was unwilling to risk a simultaneous confrontation with China. The guidance was explicit: maintain current posture, do not provoke. Admiral Richter's staff later described his reaction with a single word: frustration. But the Reagan wasn't America's only card. The United States had something in the Western Pacific that China couldn't match: a submarine force that operated in near-total invisibility. 3 Los Angeles-class fast attack submarines and 1 Virginia-class boat were already deployed in the Philippine Sea and South China Sea at the time of the surge. Their exact positions remain classified, but intelligence sources confirmed that at least 2 were repositioned to establish a barrier patrol east of Taiwan within 18 hours of the surge beginning. If you want to understand how the U.S. Navy responds to threats at sea, even when its carriers are committed elsewhere, subscribe. Because what happens next shows exactly why America's submarine force is the most feared weapon in any ocean. The submarines were silent, but they were watching everything. A Virginia-class submarine, hull number and name still classified, was tracking the lead element of the PLA surge fleet from a position roughly 40 nautical miles east of the median line. Its TB-29A towed array sonar was picking up the acoustic signatures of every major surface combatant in the formation. The boat's combat systems team was building a real-time picture of the entire Chinese fleet and transmitting compressed burst communications to Indopacom via extremely low-frequency relay. The Chinese knew American submarines were likely present. They deployed 12 Z-20F anti-submarine helicopters from their Type 075 amphibious ships, along with 4 Y-8Q maritime patrol aircraft operating from Fuzhou Air Base. Sonobuoy fields were dropped across a 60-mile arc east of the formation. None of them found the Virginia-class boat. This is the fundamental asymmetry that keeps Chinese naval planners awake at night. China has built an impressive surface fleet. Their Type 055 destroyers are genuine blue water combatants. Their anti-ship missile technology is world-class. But beneath the surface, the gap remains enormous. American submarines operate at acoustic levels so low that PLA anti-submarine warfare capabilities, still reliant heavily on hull-mounted sonar and first-generation towed arrays, simply cannot detect them at operationally relevant ranges. One Virginia-class submarine carrying 12 Tomahawk cruise missiles and 25 Mark 48 AD-cap heavyweight torpedoes represented a credible threat to the entire PLA surface formation. 4 American submarines in the theater meant that China's 60-ship fleet was operating inside an invisible kill zone, and China knew it. They just couldn't do anything about it. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels were burning white-hot. Secretary of State Catherine Aldridge placed a direct call to Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time on March 11th. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. No transcript has been released, but sources familiar with the call described it as tense. The American position was straightforward: withdraw the surge force to its home ports within 48 hours or face consequences. The specifics of those consequences were deliberately left vague. The Chinese position was equally direct: Taiwan is an internal Chinese matter. The exercises will continue for as long as Beijing deems necessary. The United States should focus on its own wars and stop interfering in the affairs of sovereign nations. Neither side blinked. In Taipei, the situation was approaching crisis level. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense activated Plan Gushin, a coastal defense contingency that placed all reserve anti-ship missile batteries on combat alert. Xiongfeng 3 supersonic anti-ship missiles were loaded onto mobile launchers and dispersed along Taiwan's western coastline. Taiwan's 4 Kidd-class destroyers put to sea from Kaohsiung. 2 Dutch-built Hai Lung submarines departed Zuoying Naval Base with full torpedo loads. Taiwan's President Chen Wei-lin addressed the nation at midnight on March 12th. The speech was calm but unambiguous. Taiwan would defend itself. Any attempt to cross the median line with hostile intent would be met with force. Japan raised its alert status to the second highest level. The Maritime Self-Defense Force sortied 8 destroyers from Sasebo and Kure, including 2 Aegis-equipped Atago-class ships carrying SM-3 ballistic missile interceptors. 2 Japanese diesel-electric Soryu-class submarines departed Kure Naval Base for patrol stations southwest of Okinawa. These boats are among the quietest conventional submarines in the world, and they were heading directly into the PLA's path. For 72 hours, the Western Pacific balanced on a knife's edge. In Dopacom, Commander Admiral James Hardin made one more request to the Pentagon. He wanted 1 Los Angeles-class submarine reassigned from CENTCOM, from the Persian Gulf theater, to reinforce the Western Pacific Barrier Patrol. The request was specific: USS Topeka, a Los Angeles-class boat operating in the Arabian Sea, providing intelligence and surveillance support for Trident Reach. Hardin argued that the submarine's impact in the Persian Gulf was marginal compared to the deterrent value it would provide in the Pacific. The request was denied, again. The reason was politics as much as strategy. Pulling a submarine from an active combat zone to counter a Chinese exercise, however provocative, would send a signal that the United States couldn't manage 2 theaters simultaneously. The National Security Council calculated that this signal would be more damaging than the temporary force imbalance. Admiral Hardin's response, according to 3 officials present, was a single sentence: "Then we're accepting risk we shouldn't accept." He was right, but the decision held. The turning point came on March 13th, not through military action, but through intelligence. At 4:17 a.m. local time, a U.S. signals intelligence satellite detected a burst transmission from the PLA Eastern Theater Command headquarters to the Surge Fleet. The transmission was encrypted using a military-grade cipher that NSA analysts couldn't break in real time, but the metadata told a story. The transmission length and routing pattern matched a previously cataloged format that PLA forces use for operational order modifications. Something had changed. Within 6 hours, satellite imagery confirmed it. The PLA amphibious ships, The 3 Type 075s and 4 Type 071s had reversed course and were heading back toward the Chinese coast. The submarines had disappeared beneath the surface and were no longer detectable. The surface combatants maintained their positions for another 24 hours, then began a gradual withdrawal. By March 15th, 42 of the 61 vessels had returned to port. The remaining 19 continued what appeared to be a genuine training exercise in waters well north of the median line. The crisis was over, or at least the acute phase was. The after-action analysis was sobering. In Dopacom's classified assessment, portions of which were later obtained by defense reporters, identified what it called the dual commitment vulnerability, the structural inability of the U.S. Navy to sustain carrier-level presence in 2 major theaters simultaneously while maintaining a credible deterrent posture in a third. The numbers were stark. The U.S. Navy operates 11 aircraft carriers. At any given time, typically 3 to 4 are in maintenance or training cycles. Of the remaining 7 or 8, 2 were committed to the Persian Gulf. 1 was in the Western Pacific with a reduced air wing. 1 was in the Atlantic on a NATO deployment. The rest were in various stages of pre-deployment workup. Against a PLA Navy that has grown to over 370 warships, the largest fleet in the world by hull count, the United States could only guarantee 1 carrier in the Pacific. That carrier, the Reagan, was outgunned and outnumbered. Like this video if you think this crisis reveals something fundamental about America's naval strategy. The U.S. submarine force had partially compensated for the carrier gap, but submarines alone cannot project the visible deterrent power that a carrier strike group provides. A carrier sitting on the horizon is a political statement. A submarine lurking beneath the waves is a military capability. Both matter, but in a crisis defined by political signaling, the absence of visible American carrier power was Beijing's entire calculation. The Chinese had not intended to invade Taiwan. Every serious analyst who reviewed the intelligence afterward reached that conclusion. The amphibious force was real, but the logistics chain needed to support an actual invasion, the fuel, the ammunition stocks, the follow-on reinforcements, was never activated. What Beijing intended was a demonstration, a proof of concept. The concept was simple. Every ship America sends to the Middle East is a ship that cannot defend Taiwan. And if the U.S. becomes involved in sustained combat operations against Iran, China has a window of opportunity in the Pacific that may not come again. For 72 hours, that window was open, and Beijing walked right up to the edge of it to make sure Washington noticed. The strategic aftermath reshaped American defense planning in ways that are still unfolding. Within 2 weeks of the crisis, the Secretary of Defense authorized an acceleration of the USS Gerald R. Ford's scheduled Pacific deployment by 4 months. The Ford, the most advanced warship ever built, 100,000 tons, electromagnetic launch catapults, a next-generation air wing of 44 F/A, 18 E/F Super Hornets, and 10 F-35C Lightning IIs, was reassigned from Atlantic operations to a Western Pacific patrol that would begin in May 2026. Indopacom also received authorization to forward deploy additional Virginia-class submarines to Guam on a rotational basis, increasing the standing submarine presence in the Western Pacific from 4 to 6 boats. And there was a quieter change, one that didn't make the headlines. The Pentagon authorized pre-positioning of Tomahawk cruise missile stocks at the Marine Corps' logistics facility on Guam and at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. These weapons, stored in hardened bunkers, could be loaded onto destroyers or submarines within hours, rather than the days it would take to ship them from continental U.S. depots. The message was being sent in a language Beijing understands: hardware. But the deeper question remained unanswered. What happens when the next crisis comes and the U.S. is still fighting in 2 places at once? The 72 hours of March 2026 exposed a vulnerability that no amount of repositioning can fully address. The United States has global commitments and a finite fleet. China has regional ambitions and a growing one. The arithmetic favors the nation that only needs to dominate one ocean. Aboard the Reagan, Admiral Richter addressed his crew on March 16th, the day after the last PLA warships withdrew. The speech was brief. He told them they had done their job. that their presence, one carrier against 60 warships, had mattered. That deterrence isn't just about numbers, it's about capability, training, and the willingness to fight. He didn't mention that his request for reinforcement had been denied. He didn't have to. Everyone aboard already knew. The Taiwan Strait is 110 miles wide. On one side, a democratic nation of 23 million people. On the other, the largest military buildup since the Cold War. And in between, the United States Navy, stretched thinner than it has been in decades, fighting wars on the other side of the world, trying to hold a line that gets harder to hold every year. March 2026 didn't break that line, but it showed everyone, in Beijing, in Taipei, in Tokyo, and in Washington, exactly how close to breaking it really is. Comment A if you think the U.S. should have moved the Reagan south immediately. Comment B if you think the Pentagon made the right call to avoid escalation. Comment C if you think this crisis proves the U.S. needs a bigger fleet. The ships have returned to port. The diplomats have resumed their conversations. Satellite imagery shows the PLA bases along the Fujian coast returning to normal activity patterns. But the submarines are still out there, somewhere beneath the dark water of the Pacific, silent, patient, watching. And in Beijing, the planners are already studying what they learned, already calculating when the next window might open. The strait is quiet tonight. It won't stay that way forever.